Once again, Visualeconomik community, the price of oil threatens to turn the economy upside down.
A new oil price hike could once again thwart the fight against inflation.
More than a year after the start of the war in Ukraine, following the shortage of energy supply due to the sanctions against Russia, and after the consequent galloping inflation that we've experienced in Western countries, it seems that the price of oil is going to skyrocket again. And who is to blame for all this? For the most part, the great Asian giant, the People's Republic of China.
Global oil demand on course for record as China's economy rebounds.
2021 and 2022 were quite worrying years for the Chinese economy. Many of you will remember the real estate crisis that began to hit the country hard, and how the COVID restrictions put its industrial sector in great difficulty. And as if that were not enough, how its financial sector began to falter too. The point is that all these problems, and above all, the failed zero COVID strategy, led to a significant decline in consumption and production within the Asian giant. As a result, demand for fuels, such as oil and gas, fell below normal. In any case, as we've seen in the previous news item, now in 2023, China has already left behind the zero COVID strategy, and its economy is recovering. Production has returned to growth, and demand for fuels, such as oil, has returned to normal levels. So let me ask you, what happens if the demand for oil increases? Indeed, prices are rising. The resurgence of the Chinese economy is what may lead to a new increase in fuel prices. Now, that's not all. In the aftermath of the pandemic, many Western countries, such as those in Europe, have also failed to recover their normal levels of activity. For example, as you can see in this graph, the number of commercial flights in Europe is still below pre-pandemic levels. What can be expected is that over the next few months, things like the number of flights and other economic activities will fully recover, thus making the demand for fossil fuels grow even more.
Global oil demand is set to increase by 2.2 million BPD.
In light of this, we already know that on the demand side, everything indicates that the price of oil will go through the roof. Even so, when it comes to black gold, the one who typically determines the final price is the supply side, or rather, the countries that control the supply. Here, we're mainly talking about OPEC countries, led by Saudi Arabia. Historically, these countries have modified oil production at will to control international crude oil prices. Following the increase in demand, it would be in the interest of all of us if OPEC were to increase crude oil production so that the price does not rise. Nevertheless, what is actually happening is just the opposite.
OPEC Plus announces surprise oil output cuts.
Demand is soaring, and OPEC is cutting production. So it all seems pretty clear. The price of oil is going to skyrocket. Or at least that's what the theory says, because in reality, something very, very strange is happening. And it has left dozens of analysts confused. Take a look at this graph. Although everything points to the future price of crude oil skyrocketing, the truth is that it has not stopped falling in recent weeks. In fact, it has fallen the most following the announcement of OPEC's production cut. The question is, how is this possible? What is driving oil to plummet despite all the projections we have seen? Well, what if I told you that one of the main theories is that OPEC is losing its enormous power to control prices? Is it possible that the oil market is about to change forever? What is behind this whole story? Today on Visualeconomik, we are going to tell you all about it, so stay tuned. As we mentioned a moment ago, and as many of you already know, the global oil market is dominated by Saudi Arabia. The Arabs have us well in their grip, energetically speaking. But interestingly, this was not always the case. The truth is, Arab dominance over oil is a relatively recent thing. You see, until around the 1960s, the oil market was controlled by 7 Western companies. 7 companies known as the Seven Sisters, including Dutch Shell, British BP, and US-based Chevron. The point is that the Seven Sisters allied themselves for many years to manage the market as they please. Basically, what they did was to coordinate to reduce the purchase prices of crude oil in the countries of origin. They got cheap oil from countries like Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, and then sold it much more expensively in developed countries like the US. As you can imagine, this was no laughing matter for the producing countries, which saw foreign companies draining their resources at bargain prices. And not surprisingly, that was something they could not tolerate. It was then that one of the most important figures in the whole story appeared, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. Perez Alfonso was a Venezuelan minister of hydrocarbons who was very concerned about the future of Venezuela's oil industry. At that time, Venezuela was already a major exporter of crude oil, and Perez Alfonso wanted to protect the country from the abusive prices of the Seven Sisters. However, this was not going to be an easy task. To fight the Seven Sisters, Venezuela needed strong allies to stand up to them. That is why, in 1960, Minister Perez Alfonso met with the authorities of the Arab countries, and only a few months later, all together, they formed the well-known OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Thereafter, OPEC designed a system to manage oil prices without the Seven Sisters being able to intervene. The system consisted of establishing production quotas. Each country limited its oil production to achieve the maximum possible price, a price that boosted profits and allowed them to get the last drop of black gold. Well, since then, in one way or another, OPEC has been the hand that has controlled the oil industry around the world, and over time, it has added several additional members that have only increased its power. So let me ask you, do you know which is one of those additional members we're talking about? Yeah, that's right, Russia. In 2016, Russia became part of the new partnership known as OPEC+. In a nutshell, if OPEC was already influential in itself, after the inclusion of Russia, which is the third largest oil producer in the world, the influence of OPEC+ skyrocketed. The history of OPEC and Russia was a fairy tale, a love story that benefited both countries. However, here comes the interesting part. What if I told you that Russia's cozy relationship with OPEC could go down the drain? What if I told you that Russia has become a headache for the Arab countries? You don't believe me? Well, just take a look at this news.
Saudi-Russia tensions growing ahead of key OPEC Plus meeting.
Do you remember that at the beginning of this video, we told you that OPEC is cutting its production to boost the price of oil in order to make more money? For that to happen, Russia has to comply with Arabia's orders and cut part of its production. All OPEC countries must act in unison. So what is the problem? The problem is that Russia is going it alone.
Russia's oil exports hit a 3-year high in March.
Russian oil exports are at multi-year highs. Russia is doing just the opposite of what OPEC told it to do. And why is it rebelling? Essentially, because of the war in Ukraine. In normal times, Russia would collaborate with OPEC. After all, it is in its best interest to have a good relationship and take advantage of the high prices that can be achieved. Even so, at the moment, Russia cannot think in the long term. It needs money to finance the war, and it needs it now. And its only way to get it is to sell as much oil and gas as possible. Of course, this excuse has done nothing to appease Saudi Arabia. Russia pledged to cut production, and it is not doing so. The question is, can Saudi Arabia put any pressure on Russia to obey the agreement reached? Well, this is where an additional problem comes into play. Let me explain. Normally, if a country is only looking out for itself and does not comply with the agreed quotas, it is in danger of suffering the Saudi bankruptcy strategy. With this strategy, Saudi Arabia has historically been able to torch entire countries from the oil industry. And how can it do that? Let's see. Saudi Arabia is the country with the largest conventional oil production capacity in the world. Not only that, it also has one of the lowest production costs of all. Because of this, when a country goes back on its commitment, Arabia can greatly increase production, force the price of oil to plummet well below the cost of production in the disloyal country, and cause its industry to go bankrupt. In fact, this was the strategy Arabia used to bring down the US fracking industry.
OPEC bid to kill off US shale sends oil price down to 2009 low.
The question now is, why doesn't Arabia threaten Russia with collapsing prices and wreck its industry? Well, it's not doing that for 3 reasons. The first is that Russia also has a lot of oil and can also produce it in a way that is not excessively expensive. So putting this country on the ropes would not be an easy task at all. Riyadh would take many other allied countries down with it along the way. The second reason is that, although it may surprise you, Saudi Arabia is not what it used to be. The Arabs are pretty much at peak production levels. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't increase production enough to sink prices.
Saudi Arabia nears its oil pumping limit.
OPEC is not at its best, and Arabia's margin for extortion seems rather limited. But there is a third factor to add to all of this. OPEC is in danger of losing its power over the market. Remember the Seven Sisters cartel? It is entirely possible that a new, similar cartel will be formed again. It is possible that the power of control over the oil market will pass into the hands of the buyer countries. For what reason? The reason is manifold, but its origin is also in the Ukraine war. With the war, Western countries set a price limit on Russian oil purchases. prices. Thus, Russia is being forced to sell its oil very cheaply, which explains why, despite exporting more barrels, it earns much less money. And you're probably thinking, why doesn't Russia sell to other places like China or India, which can pay higher prices than the Western limits? Well, that is something it is already doing. Over the last year, Russia has started sending much of its oil to Asian countries, particularly India and China. But keep in mind, the Indians and Chinese are not fools, and they have realized that they can haggle with Russia. Russia cannot sell its oil more expensively anywhere else. So Asian countries have taken advantage of this to pay Moscow pittance prices. And the thing is, this may not be a temporary thing. It seems that the Asian giants who have realized the enormous benefits of the oil price cap now want to look into the possibility of creating a long-term alliance.
India discusses oil buyers club with China.
If such a pact is consolidated and even extended to other countries, we could see a sort of reverse OPEC, an anti-OPEC that is able to control oil prices in order to push them down. At the very least, it would be game on. So, you see, OPEC's weaknesses and Russia's supply of cheap oil are more than enough reasons to understand why the oil price has not yet skyrocketed in spite of everything. However, these are not the only ones. There are even more factors to explain this phenomenon, reasons that are even more important. And let me assure you that they are reasons that many of you will not expect. Do you want to know what we're talking about? Let's take a look.
No crystal ball, cheap oil.
At the beginning of this video, we said that the recovery of the Chinese economy could boost the demand and price of oil. And in part, this is true. China started 2023 quite strongly. The problem is that a lot of data point to the fact that the Asian giant could relapse into its crisis.
China's economic recovery is losing momentum after an initial burst in consumer and business activity early in the year.
China is recovering, but not as rapidly or strongly as expected. Its youth unemployment rate is still very high, and it is not clear that it can fully overcome its huge problems: debt, the real estate bubble, trade and economic disputes, and so on and so forth. Yet economic problems are not limited to China. The truth is that over the next year, there is a risk that a new economic recession will hit countries in the rest of the world, or at least slow down economic activity around the globe. High interest rates could cause a substantial economic slowdown. This is not a 100% certainty. We do not know for sure if it will happen. But for example, economic confidence indices in the US are at decade lows. So what does all this mean? It means that demand for oil is likely to fall if there is a new global recession, or even, at best, if the economy slows down. But pay attention, because that's not all. With the fear of a possible crisis, companies and investors in many countries are starting to stockpile dollars in a big way. They fear that their local currencies will lose value and want to keep their savings safely in US currency. In the same fashion, the US banking crisis has caused many banks and monetary funds to start storing money in their coffers in order to avoid financial problems such as those suffered by Silicon Valley Bank. In short, worldwide demand for dollars has skyrocketed. All of this, coupled with attractive US interest rates, has led to the price of the dollar soaring against other currencies, such as the Chinese yuan. And the point is that if the price of the dollar goes up, the price of oil goes down. Think about it. Oil is usually traded in dollars. If the dollar becomes more expensive, the countries of the world would have less capacity to buy dollars, and therefore cannot pay as much for oil. Conclusion: oil prices are trending downward. And on top of that, beyond the macroeconomic issues, it should also be noted that green energies could advance further than expected. Demand for wind turbines has soared by 30% since 2022. The new US climate laws are set to increase green power generation capacity by 1/3 by the end of the year. Meanwhile, there is also the European Union's plans to become independent of Russian oil, as well as the expansion of the electrified vehicle fleet. Well, these are all factors that could contribute to a further decline in global demand for crude oil. In any case, the future, as always, is uncertain, and probably the key to this whole issue lies in the price of the dollar, as well as in the possible economic crisis that could affect China or the rest of the world in the coming months. Also, although OPEC is not at its best, Saudi Arabia has once again announced production cuts on its own, and it remains to be seen whether a new anti-OPEC organization could bear fruit, something that, to tell the truth, does not seem so straightforward. And that is why it is now your turn. What do you think will happen to the price of oil over the next few months? Will China manage to rise from the ashes once and for all? What will happen to the price of the dollar in the medium to short term? As always, you can leave me your answers down in the comments. If you like the video, please like it, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Take care, I'll see you next time.